Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Passport to Peru lecture series. My name is Kiernan, and I will be your host on behalf of Peru for Less and Inca Expert Travel. Today's lecture is focused on the nature of the Andes with our expert, Dr. Javier Puente. I firstly would like to thank everyone watching with us on Zoom and Facebook Live. We are so happy to share this event with you. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Dr. Puente will be answering some questions from the audience after his lecture, so please feel free to submit questions for him at any time throughout the presentation. For those joining us on Zoom, you can do so with the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom browser. For those on Facebook, just leave your question in the comment section of the Facebook Live. After the event, be on the lookout for an email from us with a link to the recorded lecture. Today, we are so pleased to welcome back Dr. Javier Puente, an interdisciplinary scholar of Andean environments and politics. Javier is an assistant professor of Latin American Studies at Smith College, where he teaches classes about Andean environments and politics and agrarian landscapes and rural environments. Today, Javier will explore the Andes' paradoxical role as both a pivotal feature of Peru's diverse cultural, political, and social developments, and an alleged obstacle against the contemporary ideals of progress. He's the author of more than half a dozen publications, received a PhD from Georgetown University, and has held appointments at Lehigh University, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, the John Carter Brown Library, and the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. When he isn't teaching, Javier enjoys traveling, jogging, playing football, boxing, and cooking. Hi, Javier. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hi, Kiernan. Good night. And it's a pleasure to be with you and with all your audience again.
Great, we're so happy to have you here. Before we get started, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling our audience about one of your favorite destinations in the Andes and what makes it so special.
Absolutely. My favorite destination in the Andes and in the world is Cusco, of course. And the reason why it's special is because on the one hand, I grew up there, but on the other hand, there is something uniquely magical that happens to any visitor really who has the opportunity of going there. And I encourage all of you to visit, those of you who haven't yet, as soon as they can, as soon as this pandemic is over. There is just a very intimate connection with that space.
I completely agree. It was actually the first place that I ever came to when I came to Peru, and I loved it so much I had to move here. So I definitely agree and second that. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and remind everyone that you can send in questions at any time, either through Zoom or through Facebook. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Javier. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kiernan. And as it is accordingly professorial, I have prepared a few slides to share with you tonight. I wanted to reflect on the Andes as an environmental space and tell you probably a narrative that most travelers are not used to. And that is, why do the Andes matter? Right? Why do the Andes matter? Beyond the cultural, beyond the archaeological, beyond the ruins, beyond the Inca narratives, why do they matter? And what do they matter in the past, present, and future of Peru as a country? So we start with a slide that includes an image of the Apu Vinicunca, the Rainbow Mountain, as it's called, and I think Peru for Less actually offers some interesting tours there. And this colorful image serves me to introduce perhaps the big three takeaway ideas of today's lecture. The first one being that what we now know as Peru, as this nation state, is in fact and has been for quite some time the geographical and geopolitical epicenter of the Andean region. Most of the Andes are located in what became Peru. Peru is heavily so an Andean country. Its geography, its population densities, its structures of production, its very understanding as a nation, it's fundamentally shaped by the presence of these mountains. Of course, the Andes, historically speaking, are best known by being the cradle of the Inca civilization. And the Inca state once held control over the territories that became southern Colombia, all the way to northern Chile and Argentina. And even in that moment of territorial expansion of the Andes, these territories that became later on in the 19th century Peru had the Andes as an absolutely central feature. The second big takeaway idea has to do with how the Andes shape everything. And by everything, I mean both the geographical spaces, the different regions that compose the Peruvian territory, and also its livelihoods, right? Flora, fauna, and peoples who live in all this territory are on a daily basis shaped by the presence of the Andes. So, in as much as we often identify the Andes merely as the mountains, as these high elevation regions, the Amazon basin wouldn't exist without the Andes. All the moist that comes from the Atlantic gets trapped in the eastern frontier of the Peruvian territory and completely create the ideal conditions, the ideal environmental and geographic conditions for the Amazon basin to exist and to be as tropical and as humid as it gets to be. Similarly, on the western slope of the Andes, as the moment you arrive to Peru and you land in Lima and you observe this seemingly very obvious desertic feature of the Peruvian coast, how desertic it is, how arid this region gets to be, it's profoundly shaped by the Andes. Ultimately, though, these environments and climates that merge together along the coast, which include, among other things, the Humboldt Current, this cold current of a stream that runs south to north and creates these absolutely rich environments, rich marine environments that, for instance, nourish all the culinary boom, wouldn't exist without the Andes as well. So that is all to say that the Andes really shape every single aspect of the Peruvian territory and how life exists in this country. Finally, the third takeaway idea has to do with something that was shared by Kieran in the introduction, which I call the Andean paradox. And what is the Andean paradox? The Andean paradox is that the Andes as a region, its characteristics, its high elevation, the fact that oxygen gets very thin the higher you go, has sometimes been pitched, been portrayed and presented as a hostile environment, as something that hasn't been fully tamed, as something difficult to domesticate as a geographical space. And insofar of that, it has been presented as a burden for multiple ideas of progress, particularly economic, social, and political progress. At the same time, though, those same Andes, because of all the rich natural resources that exist there, because of the biodiversity that compose this region, are also presented as the cradle for some ideals related to the development of their country. So it's both a cradle of natural resources and also a burden for those same ideals of progress. And it seems that the Andes cannot really get detached from that paradox and continue to be presented in this adamantly paradoxical way. So those are the three big takeaway ideas, and I'm happy to discuss them in further detail during the Q&A. So let me start saying something about a unique feature of the Andes, and that is the existence, the sort of very ancient existence of crop domestication in this region. And let me start saying something about what some environmental historians known as the civilizing crop principle. The civilizing crop principle basically argues that civilizations worldwide, not just in the Andes, Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley, ancient Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, all of them have emerged, consolidated, and expanded and become more sophisticated as a civilization around the domestication of a single crop. These crops belong up to today to our daily diet. They include barley, wheat, rice, millet, you name it, right? Depending on which region you're talking about, each of these crops held a very central role in fostering civilization, in fostering population densities, in fostering new structures of power, and centralizing principles of authority. The Americas were not an exception to this civilizing crop principle. In the case of Mesoamerica, meaning Northern Central America and the central area of contemporary Mexico, corn held that primary civilizing crop role. In the case of the Andes, potatoes are that civilizing crop. So nowadays, we have identified, I think, up to 3,000 varieties of potatoes. We know that potatoes were first civilized in the Andes. We know that they were the staple item of pre-Columbian diets for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We also know that potatoes became a major staple item of the Columbian exchange, the biological and environmental exchange that occurred between the Americas, Europe, and the rest of the world in the in the dawn of colonization and conquest and the globalization of the world. Potatoes made their way throughout Europe and then ultimately to East Asia, nourishing population expansions, population growth rates that were completely unprecedented. Ireland, for instance, became hugely dependent on potato consumption, so much and so forth that in the 19th century, a fungus created a major famine. A fungus that affected potato crops created a major famine. Archaeological records suggest that potatoes were first domesticated at least 10,000 BCE in the southern altiplano. The southern altiplano is the plateau that is shared between Peru and Bolivia, which is, by the way, the second highest plateau in the world after the Tibetan plateau that the Himalayas made. So approximately 10,000 years BCE, there are records, there are archaeological records of domestication of potatoes. Along the coast, though, there are well-recorded records of the presence of potato and potato consumption around 2500 BCE. So what does that mean? That means that soon after potatoes were domesticated, within a few centuries, potatoes, the Andean production of potatoes, circulated throughout the Andes and beyond, creating and fostering equally unprecedented networks of trade and circulation. And these networks of trade and circulation ultimately led to new forms of sociability and new forms of political organization, primarily centered on kinship ties. Without understanding that role of the civilizing crop, of potatoes as a civilizing crop, the expansion and circulation of potatoes throughout the Andes and beyond into the coast, probably also down into the Amazon basin, and without understanding kinship ties as a principle for accessing a crop that was produced in a specific region but was needed elsewhere, we cannot really understand any form of civilization formation in the Andes, including the Incas. Perhaps, however, one of the most interesting aspects of the cultivating crop principle is the idea that while we cultivate crops, we also domesticate ourselves. So humans, probably thousands of years ago, did not have a digestive feature for processing barley, wheat, rice, millet, milk, you name it. We developed that. We developed that through domesticating these crops, domesticating animals, and adapting ourselves to the domestication of flora and fauna. And it's interesting to see sometimes how that domestication permeated and affected other forms of human life, including our vocabularies. And let me give you an example related always to potatoes. So in Quechua, one of the indigenous languages of Peru, of the contemporary Peruvian Andean region, the word huacha signifies a number of different things. First, orphan. Second, a situation of social isolation, of social orphanage. But thirdly, and most interesting, it also refers to being a potato eater. So what is the repercussion of this? Well, in the Andes, no matter how poor a person can be, no matter how extra you can be, it is perceived, it is understood that you at least can access potatoes, that you can at least can access potatoes as a staple item of your diet. No matter how poor, no matter how orphan, no matter how uh, limited access you have to anything else, there will always be potatoes for you to get fed. So that's how far the cultivation of potatoes and its civilizing role went. How about animals? The case of animals in the Andes is equally interesting, as interesting as plants. There are approximately 1,000 species of animals who currently live in the Andes. Two-thirds of which are known to be endemic to the Andes. Of these 1,000 different animals, 600 of them are mammals, and a 13% of those are equal endemic to the Andes. Um, and with animals occurs something very similar to what occurred with crops. They also have a civilizing role. They also have a domesticating role. They not only get domesticated, they not only tame us, tame our diet, and affect our livelihoods. They are also animals, and domesticated animals are also instruments for domesticating landscapes. So what you currently known as Europe wouldn't exist in terms of how refashioned the environment had become over centuries, if not thousands of years, if it weren't for the role of five animals first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent that gradually made their way into Europe. And those animals are known as the Big Five: sheep, goat, pig, cows, and horses. Um, all these animals, of course, made their way to the Americas eventually after the conquest and colonization of the region, and throughout the Columbian exchange. In the Andes, we also had some animals that play an equally civilizing role. One of them were Andean camelids, llamas, and another one, and here I go, it's a bit of my own argument, so I hope you can bear with me. Guinea pigs, cuyes, an equally important staple item of Andean diets. I know they are a pet where I live in the United States, and I hope this doesn't sound horrifying to some of you in the audience, but they are a delicacy in the Andes. So just a few words about camelid species in the Andes. There are 4 known species with different degrees of domestication. Uh, the, sorry, alpacas and llamas are the most domesticated species of camelids, whereas vicuñas and guanacos are the wildest ones. Guanaco really sort of the wild ancestor of llamas and alpacas, and vicuñas are another subspecies that wasn't really able to be fully domesticated. It's still a tame animal, but for vicuñas to be raised and to become a source of wool, they have to remain largely wild. Otherwise, you cannot really raise them. All the domestication of these animals occur roughly 6,000 to 7,000 BCE. And archaeological records about this domestication are equally abundant. These animals, vicuñas, alpacas, guanacos, llamas, while it's certain that they couldn't carry people, that they didn't offer the equivalence of what horses offer in East Asia, the Central Asian steppe, or Europe, they did provide Andean peoples, past, present, the opportunity to carry much more weight than what any person could, and therefore maximize the capacity of transporting goods throughout long distances, particularly at high elevations, where oxygen is very thin and hypoxia tends to affect people. And that's really important because, once again, going back to the networks that were created to make Andean civilization, without the carrying capacities of these animals, such networks wouldn't have existed. Such networks and kinship ties wouldn't have been created. And hence, what you know as the Inca Empire, the Inca state, or any other preceding major Andean civilization wouldn't have existed. What about guinea pigs? What's my point about guinea pigs? Well, this is one of the focal areas of research that I'm developing these days. So guinea pigs are known to be domesticated at least 5,000 BCE. And they are, in lieu of a better term, guinea pigs are masters of epigenetic evolutions. These small rodents adapted to a particularly, quote unquote, hostile environment. An environment in which most animals, because of the lack of oxygen, tend to lose first fat and then much of their body mass to maximize their oxygen consumption. All animals exposed to this sort of environment tend to suffer the same. That happened with sheep when they were first introduced to the Andes. It happened with goats. It happened with cows. They had to adapt. There was an entire husbandry project to create animals that were more able to really prosper and flourish in high elevation environments. But the guinea pigs did that adaptation on their own. In doing so, they retained fat, they retained most of their body mass, and these small rodents became an ideal source for animal protein for high altitude consumption. Of any other animal that would provide a supply of animal protein, this small rodent, again, a master of epigenetic evolution, adapt itself to high altitude environments and became a staple item of Andean diets. Guinea pigs, by the way, side note, are currently studied because they seem also to adapt to climate change conditions. They, within just a couple of generations, apparently generate new physical capacities that help them confront really dramatic environmental changes around them, whether it's temperature, aridity, or excessive moist. So they are really fascinating animals. You should follow them. Sometimes Peru is presented as an agrarian country, and it's presented exacerbating its biodiversity and showcasing what I showcased on my presentation too, how rich in terms of flora and fauna the Peru and the Peruvian Andes are. But I think in reality, Peru is a mining country, for better or worse. Mining, contemporary mining, represents the largest percentage of our GDP. the largest percentage of our exports. And it has fueled, for better and worse, everything that we associate with economic development. Mining has a long history as well. It goes all the way back to pre-Columbian times, when the first Andean civilizations became masters of extraction of minerals and the manipulation of these same minerals. Of course, the pre-Columbian mining expertises and the widespread use of precious minerals, particularly gold, fostered that myth that completely fascinated European conquistadors about the existence of a golden kingdom, the existence of El Dorado, the existence of the Paititi, the existence of that lost golden city that was never found, and that in many ways Machu Picchu was believed to be at some point. We have mined the Andes extensively and deeply since colonial times. Potosi, a pivotal center of the Andes, currently in contemporary Bolivia, supply all the silver that the Spanish Empire needed between 50 and 1650. All the silver extracted from Potosi triple the amount of metallic currency that circulated in the world within 1 century. No other space and no other extractive regime has created such an economic impact at a global scale like Potosi did. All that silver was purified with mercury that was extracted from Huancavelica, the central Andean Peruvian town, creating a complex, a Huancavelica Potosi complex that polluted basically a corridor between these two cities with mercury, and polluted not only places but peoples for hundreds of years. Ultimately, the adamant presence of precious minerals and rich ores in this region created extractivism as the primary economic regime in the Andes. And by extractivism, I mean this human obsession with transforming whatever is extracted from nature into cash in the most rapid way, in the most accelerated fashion. And that extractivist approach to nature hasn't gone away. In fact, it has persisted, creating gruesome human and environmental consequences that are still seen in our days. Mining in Peru is responsible for most of the environmental pollution that affects the country to our days. But to end on a happy note, on a thriving note, more than happy perhaps, let's talk a little bit about the human geography of the Andes. Because unlike what happens with mining, in which, you know, what it's left behind is basically a dead space, the Andes are very well alive. The Andes are also the people who live there, who, by the way, understand their own existence embedded within nature, not separated like the rest of the West, right? A division between nature and society doesn't exist in the Andes. Andean peoples really perceive and live their lives embedded within nature. Central to livelihood in the Andes is the ideal of a comunidad, a community. A community that sometimes is presented to be an inheritor of the pre-Columbian ayllus, the pre-Columbian communities that once inhabited the Andes, that once made up all the Andean civilizations that existed in the Peruvian Andes. These communities, first as indigenous communities, endured the colonial regime, endured the demographic collapse that resulted from the arrival of European diseases, in which approximately 9 out of 10 indigenous peoples throughout the Andes died as a result of the lack of immunity against European diseases like smallpox, chickenpox, and flu. Um, they survived that, they endured that. And these indigenous communities became the key component of the labor that the Spanish Empire needed for becoming an empire. Without the survival of this indigenous community, there wouldn't have been a Spanish Empire as we knew it eventually. Without these same indigenous communities, there wouldn't be the nation states that later, after independence, emerged throughout the region, including Peru, of course. These indigenous communities, particularly after 1969, were relabeled by the state as campesinos. And they made up the labor that nourished the country, that have taken the country throughout these dark times of pandemic and economic crisis, and continue to supply all the labor needed for the agrarian activities that ultimately feed the country and feed the world. Think about the global circulation of all the agrarian commodities from the Andes that are sold throughout the world, quinoa being one of them. These are the communities that you will get to see also when you travel to Peru, and you might see them differently as just more than people, active, thriving elements of the spaces that they live in. So I want to finish here to not make it very long, and I would happily take your questions now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture, Javier. It was great to learn more about the Andes Mountains with you and their impact on Peru. To start, we have a few questions from the audience. Our first question, they would like to know, one of the audience members would like to know if in the future you think we will move away from extraction in the mountains, and if so, how?
Thank you for the question. We would hope so. We would hope so. And some years ago, Ecuador provided a response to that question with this whole holistic approach known as Buen Vivir or Summa Causai, the possibility of granting rights to nature and treating nature as a living agent with their specific rights. Um, Now, in spite of that little window of hope that Ecuador opened, that actually was transformed into constitutional law. So all this summa causai approach is present in the Ecuadorian constitution. It's letra muerta. It's something that is not fully observed, and Ecuador continues to have this extractivist approach to nature. So it requires more than law. It requires individual, personal, emotional change. And of course, this has to happen first on the individual level and gradually move to the collective level. But if we're expecting this to come from state initiatives, I am not very hopeful about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. I think that's a very important aspect, not only the law side, but also the human side. So hopefully that is the way we are moving into the future, and it's nice to see that that there is kind of precedent already in Ecuadorian law. So maybe moving forward we can just run with that energy. Another question, I would also like to let anyone know if they haven't submitted questions yet, there's still time. Please feel free to submit questions. We do have about 10 more minutes for this, so I'd be happy to take some more. The next one we do have is from another audience member, and they would like to know, what is your favorite variety of potato?
Oh, wow, that's a tricky one. I like so many of them, but I think Papa Wapa Amarilla are the best. I like potatoes that are, I don't know how to translate. Maybe you can help me here, Kieran. Terrosas, right? Not so watery, but like drier potatoes.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, does that make sense? So Papa Guairo and Papa Amarilla, maybe you can write this on the chat, but they are my favorite. Now, that said, I think the average Peruvian knows maybe 10 varieties of potatoes and has consumed a number around those. Some of those 3,000 varieties that I have mentioned are not consumable, are not apt for human consumption, but many more are. And, just a quick travel to a small indigenous or campesino community in the Sacred Valley might unveil a variety that doesn't circulate beyond small local or regional markets. So I encourage you to do your own research and your traveling.
Definitely. I agree with that. When you're in Peru, you have to try more than 5 types of potatoes at the minimum. Because there are, even in the grocery stores, you can still find at least about 10, 5 to 10 varieties, which is more than we can say in the US. So it's definitely a really great part of the experience here. Okay, another question we have is from an anonymous attendee, and they would like to know how Amazon deforestation impacts the Andes.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. Primarily because what the vegetation of the Amazon basin creates is moist, right? And it's moist that elevates and sometimes makes it through the eastern slope of the Andes, and therefore makes its way into the inter-Andean valleys, bringing rain into this region, but doesn't make it beyond that. That's the reason why, among other things, it never rains in Lima, because the western slope of the Andes is so high up and so much moist gets trapped in the inter-Andean valleys that it just doesn't make its way to the coast, and you rarely see rain in Lima. You rarely see rain in Lima, and as Kiernan can probably attest.
I can definitely attest to that.
The sky is always great, but it never rains.
Exactly. Yeah, it looks like it's going to rain, but it doesn't.
But deforestation might have an indirect effect, and that is related to biodiversity. So a number of the species that exist in the Amazon basin that depend on the Amazon vegetation move to the Andes and have the Andes as part of their circuits of circulation, you name it, birds, amphibians, and the destruction that happens in the Amazon basin still affects the Andes indirectly. I can see Anticucho now.
Yes, you did decide to join this time. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I think that's definitely a good thing to keep in mind, is that even though we might not be able to see, direct impacts by it, I think indirectly it's definitely something to keep in mind. Well, we do have a few more questions. One from Lynn. They would like to know if you think that the Peruvian government will stabilize now, or if we're still in for many changes. It's a little off topic, but I do know you know some information about this. So.
Oh my God, I have an entire podcast on that, so I'm happy to share a link later on. So I don't think the crisis has been resolved, because there are some demands for structural transformation that naming a new president doesn't really fix. And so I think, to me, it's interesting to see that people in the streets as a political agent are demanding a constitutional reform. In fact, the writing of a new constitution. Like the current constitution that rules Peru was written in 1993 as a result of another coup, and in the dawn of the autocracy established by Alberto Fujimori. And so, rightfully so, young Peruvians are demanding that we want to fully enter the 21st century with a fully democratic constitution. Another claim that is contended by the youth is police reform, something that is actually a global claim. It also happens here in the United States. It happened in Chile. It happened in Colombia. It happened in Ecuador. It's going to happen in Guatemala within the next few days. So with all these truly structural adjustments, I think we'll be overly optimistic and a bit naive to say that the crisis has been resolved.
Yes, being here in Lima, you can definitely feel that people are, they feel like the move that Congress made the right move to name a new president, but definitely that the fight is not over completely. But I do feel that now, it's not as explosive as it was, when it first happened. So I think now what's next is just the people are going to be watching to make sure that the government does, what they should do for the people. Wonderful. Well, to get back to the Andes, well, let's see. Someone would like to know if the potatoes that are not suitable for consumption, what are they used for?
I mean, so they're not used, right? And that's an interesting question, because I think it is, we depart from the assumption that anything that is produced, that grows out there, should be used for something, that it should be useful. They're not consumed by us, but one of the things that probably does is fixing nitrogen to the soil. And that nitrogen to the soil helps other crops that are up for human consumption. And of course, what's more interesting is that the ones that are consumed are the result of the human bioengineering of these species. So these last few days, I've been hearing a lot about the Minister of Agriculture, the new Minister of Agriculture, claiming the need for incorporated indigenous knowledge into the scientific understandings of agriculture that we now have, forgetting that those indigenous knowledge are as scientific as what we practice in the West as science. They are the result of observation, experimentation, selection, and hundreds of years of operations that created those varieties that we now consume. So Andean peoples for thousands of years have been masters of bioengineering, of natural bioengineering. Perhaps those that are not suitable for human consumption should be left not suitable for human consumption. There's something else that we don't fully understand yet.
Definitely. Great answer. Thanks so much. Okay, we still have a few more, so I'm just going to keep going. The next one is from an anonymous attendee, and they would like to know if people on the eastern side or the western side of the Andes see each other differently, or do they see themselves as a single population, or is the population mainly one side or area due to the land?
That's a fantastic question. So I have used widely on the lecture, and actually I'll take the question also as a form of constructive criticism, because I have used widely the notion of Andean peoples, right? But Andean peoples are very, very diverse. And one of the most fundamental bases of that diversity is where they live, right? Whether they live on the eastern slope or the western slope, or at what altitude they live. Because altitudinal variation really determines new forms of livelihood that are best suited for living and prospering in that specific condition. Now, that said, as diverse as they are, as separate as they are, some really interesting and intriguing stuff happens in the Andes. And let me use my hands to make this example, right? So imagine that the Andes are this sort of elevation, right? And you have a community X here, right? And then a community Y here. And you just imagine that you keep going uphill, right? You leave community X, you approach community Y, and you would imagine that you keep going and you will find another community, but all of a sudden you enter once again community X. So that principle of settlement is known as discontinuous settlement. And it's something absolutely unique to high elevation environments. It also happens in the Himalayas. So because of production is so specialized depending on altitude, sometimes the same community, in order to access equally specialized production, would settle in two different spaces for the purpose of accessing whatever is produced in those two different regions. Despite being geographically distant and in fact not territorially continuous, they understand their belonging, their existence as part of the same community in ways that really have baffled any state power that has tried to rule that principle of settlement and livelihood.
That is wonderful. I actually did not realize that. So thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting to think about how space and doesn't necessarily mean the end of a community just because you're not, connected physically. I think that's something that we can all keep in mind too in this day of the times that we're in. Okay, well, we do still have
Indeed.
a few more. So let's see. Let me go ahead. Another point from Edgar on Facebook that he says, another point we are worried about is the receding of glaciers. We are about the 50%, around the 50% has been lost in the last 40 years. What do you think we must do to stop or reduce the loss of the Andes, of the glaciers of the
That's
Andes?
a fascin. That's another fascinating question, and it's something that I recently presented on in a faculty seminar because it's another part of my focal area of research. Um, because in the ethnographic work I have conducted in the Andes, I found a very intriguing narrative held by Andean peoples who, unlike us in the West, right? Let's call it like that. Unlike us elsewhere beyond the Andes, some Andean communities fully understand climate change, fully understand what's happening. They also understand the anthropogenic nature of climate change. In other words, the fact that we are producing this change, but they accept it. They accept it as part of a natural cycle that has to happen, and they see themselves as caretakers of the end, that their role is to live well while the end comes,
Wow.
fully knowing that whatever lies at the other end of the end, right, in the other cycle, at the beginning of the other cycle, might or might not include us. And that has really led me to question, how do we integrate two different epistemologies of climate change? An indigenous epistemology of climate change that is all about letting go, and our epistemology of climate change that argues, yes, we're worried about the glaciers, but what we're really worried about is our own survival. Are we worried about the glaciers, or are we worried about the fact that we cannot drink water from the glaciers anymore, right? And truth be told, in the aftermath of climate change, the Earth will continue. What might not continue is the livelihoods that we have had up to this point. That's something that Andean people seem to understand better, and they are just ready to accept whatever end happens because it's part of a natural cycle.
Yeah, that is certainly very different from a lot of the perspectives that we confront in the Western world. So that's really interesting to think about. Well, we have just a few more questions. They're a bit lighter. So let's see, is there a Peruvian potato vodka?
I heard that some people who are producing Peruvian vodka. I haven't tried it yet, so I cannot endorse it. But I'm going to Peru soon, and I'll try to find Peruvian vodka. But yes, I heard that there is Peruvian, like Peruvian potato-based vodka.
I'm pretty sure recently a distillery in the Sacred Valley opened up. I think it's called Distilleria Andina. I'm pretty sure they do potato vodka, Peruvian potato vodka.
There you
And then
go. We can
also,
do
if
we
you
can do
know,
some sort of.
yeah, we can do some
No,
kind
I
of
was I
tasting.
was saying we can do some sort of show for our audience
That would be so
trying the
fun.
Peruvian vodka.
I think they would like that. Well, speaking of potato drinks, do you know what the national drink of Peru is? Is it a potato liquor?
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. The official national drink, of course, is pisco, and it's grape based, and as a result of course, European influence in Peru. It's basically a grappa. It's some sort of like Peruvian brandy, and that is the official one.
And it is delicious. It's delicious too.
It is. It
Well,
is. It is. It is. It is. But I think that question was sort of hiding this sort of proposal of turning Peruvian vodka into the national drink, which I would in principle support.
I'm not against it either. The Pisco can share the spotlight. Okay, well,
Yes.
I did find we have two more questions. One is from an anonymous attendee, and they say that they've been to Peru. The place is really magical. For tourists like us, how can we contribute to preserve the region? The hotels at Aguas Calientes are affecting the quality of water and the environment. Are there business limits? I guess mostly that we should just focus on, what can tourists do to preserve the region?
I think being mindful. I think that, I mean, um, awareness is good. Awareness per se is good, and being mindful about the impact you make when you travel, your carbon print, the environmental consequences of tourism. Of course, you know, it would be completely pointless to, you know, tell people, you know, don't visit, don't travel, because it does create other side benefits.
Mhm.
And you know, in the aftermath of this pandemic crisis, the one thing that we're going to try to do probably once all of this is solved is traveling and visiting places that we wanted to visit for so long, and then all of a sudden have felt more distant in recent times. But I mean, I think mindfulness, just asking this question, right, and
Mhm.
traveling with this question in mind. How is that? I think that would be my piece of advice. Traveling with that question in mind permanently. You know,
I
what
agree.
am I doing? What impact is this creating? That alone will go a long way.
I completely agree. Thank you so much. Well, let's see. Our last question is just about Cusco weather, and they would like to know when is the best time to visit Cusco for the weather.
It's always the best time to visit Cusco. What are you talking about?
I agree.
It really depends on whether you want some rain or not. So you know, in between November and March, it's fairly rainy season in most of the Andes, particularly in Cusco. And
Hmm.
it might make your trip a little bit wet. It might well be the case that the Inca Trail will not be open because rains tend to affect the capacity of walking up and down the slopes of the Andes in the Inca Trail. But otherwise, it's always a good season to visit Cusco.
I completely agree. Well, I'll end on this. I'll end this Q&A session on a note from Lynn, and they say thank you so much for answering their question on politics. Peru has had a special place in their heart, and they've lived through the first golpe with Balloon Terry, and they have high hopes for its future. So I think that's
Thank you so
a
much
nice.
for yeah, thank you so much for caring, and thank you for spreading the word, and thank you for helping us change the narrative here in the U.S. that, you know, what happened a few weeks ago on November 9th was not an impeachment; it was a coup, and the crisis continues. So thank you for raising awareness about what happens in Peru. It matters. It matters to Peru. It matters to Peruvians. It matters to the region, and it should matter here too. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I completely agree. And also thank you everyone else for submitting some great questions, and Javier for taking the time to answer them. We really appreciate you joining us again today. We do have another lecture coming up with you in just a week and a half. So on Wednesday, December 2nd at 8:30 p.m., please tune in again. And Javier will be talking about Lima this time, Lima's melting pot. So we hope you all will be able to join us. And thank you again, Javier, for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, and also thank you to Peru for Less and Inca Expert Travel for hosting this great event. Please feel free to check out their websites to learn more about what we offer. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.